In a world where love knows no bounds and family transcends bloodlines, stories of unexpected connections often leave the deepest impressions. Today, I'm going to share one such heartwarming tale, a story of hope, prejudice, and the powerful bond that can form between two unlikely individuals. Imagine this: a wealthy white man, living a life of luxury, suddenly finds himself drawn into a world far from his own. His name is Richard Williams, a self-made millionaire with everything money could buy. But something was missing. He was a successful businessman, known for his charitable contributions. Yet his life felt hollow and incomplete. Deep down, he longed for more than the financial success that surrounded him. One day, Richard's life took a turn no one, not even he, could have predicted. On a routine visit to a local charity event, fate intervened. He crossed paths with someone who would forever change the course of his life, a little girl named Zoe, barely 7 years old, with deep brown eyes that held a mixture of fear and sadness. Zoe was an orphan. She had been through more than any child should ever have to endure. Abandoned at birth, she had spent her young life bouncing between foster homes, with no place to truly call home and no one to call family. What made this encounter even more remarkable was the stark contrast between them: Zoe, a young black girl from the foster system, and Richard, the wealthy white man who had everything but a family of his own. But something happened when their eyes met that day. There was an unspoken connection, one that transcended race, class, and circumstance. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt an overwhelming urge to protect this little girl, to give her love and security she had been denied for so long. Against the advice of his friends, colleagues, and even some family members, Richard made a decision that shocked everyone. He adopted Zoe, a move that sent ripples through his social circles and even made headlines in local community. People whispered about it, some with praise, others with skepticism. Why would a millionaire, a white millionaire, adopt a black girl from foster system? Was it a publicity stunt? Was he trying to fill some void in his life? The questions were endless, and the scrutiny was relentless. As Richard welcomed Zoe into his opulent home, world watched and waited, anticipating challenges they might face. But no one could have expected what came next. Not the media, not Richard's inner circle, and certainly not Richard himself. At first, things seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Richard and Zoe bonded quickly, sharing moments of joy and laughter. But as they settled into their new life together, cracks began to show. The outside world wasn't as accepting as Richard had hoped. Prejudice, racism, and assumptions about their unconventional family dynamic began to creep in. The stares, the whispered comments, and judgmental looks became part of their daily reality. And then, something happened that changed everything, an event so shocking that it would put Richard's love for Zoe to the ultimate test. Just as it seemed they had overcome the odds, an unexpected twist threatened to tear them apart. Richard was faced with an impossible choice, one that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about love, family, and sacrifice. But what was this shocking event? What could possibly put their bond in jeopardy after all they had been through? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into this incredible story of resilience, heartbreak, and power of unconditional love. You won't believe the outcome, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. As Richard stood in his grand foyer, gazing at framed portraits of his ancestors on the wall, he couldn't help but wonder how they might view the choices he had made. His mansion, a sprawling estate that overlooked acres of lush greenery, had been passed down through generations. It symbolized wealth, legacy, and a life of privilege. But now, it represented something new, something far more personal. Zoe, the young girl who had unexpectedly entered his life, was upstairs in her new room, her laughter occasionally echoing down the marble hallways. Richard smiled to himself, yet a shadow of unease crossed his face. There was something about this entire situation that felt fragile, as if at any moment it could shatter. He had anticipated challenges, but not the overwhelming tension that seemed to be creeping into his life from all directions. And deep down, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test them both in ways they could never have imagined. Let's step back for a moment to understand how this story began. Richard had always been a private man. Despite his public appearances and charitable endeavors, few people truly knew him. He had grown up in an affluent family, attended the best schools, and had everything handed to him except love. His parents, consumed by their own social ambitions, had never been emotionally available. Richard's father had seen vulnerability as weakness, teaching his son that success was measured by wealth and influence. not by relationships or emotions. And so, Richard grew up believing that if he worked hard enough, earned enough, and built enough, he would somehow fill the void left by the absence of love in his life. By the time he was 30, he had amassed a fortune through savvy investments and strategic business decisions. He became the quintessential self-made millionaire, living in the lap of luxury, yet finding himself alone at every dinner party and every charity gala. It wasn't until he encountered Zoe that something shifted within him. There was an innocence about her, but also a profound sadness, one that resonated deeply with Richard. Even though their lives couldn't have been more different, she had been abandoned at birth, tossed aside by a system that had failed her time and time again. And yet, despite all that, she still smiled, still hoped for a better tomorrow. Richard had never considered himself the fatherly type. In fact, the very idea of parenthood had seemed foreign to him. But something about Zoe had stirred a sense of purpose within him that went beyond wealth or status. It was as if, for the first time, he had found someone who needed him not for his money, but for something far more valuable: love and security. When Richard brought Zoe home for the first time, everything seemed to fall into place. He went out of his way to make her feel comfortable, transforming one of the many unused bedrooms into a vibrant, welcoming space filled with toys, books, and anything else she might need. Zoe, quiet and reserved at first, slowly began to open up, showing glimpses of the playful child she once must have been. But despite the joy and laughter they shared within the walls of the mansion, there were growing tensions outside. Richard's decision to adopt Zoe hadn't gone unnoticed, and the whispers among his social circle were growing louder. People were talking: neighbors, colleagues, even the media. It wasn't long before the local newspapers ran stories about the wealthy philanthropist who adopted a black girl from the foster system. At first, Richard brushed it off. He had grown used to media attention, and Zoe's presence in his life wasn't something he felt needed defending. But soon, the whispers became more direct, turning into blatant questions and even accusations. Friends and acquaintances began to ask why he had chosen to adopt Zoe, implying that his decision was either a misguided attempt at charity, or worse, a calculated move for publicity. One particularly uncomfortable moment came during a business dinner. A longtime colleague of Richard's, an older man named William, leaned in with a smug smile and asked, "So Richard, what made you decide to take this unconventional route? I mean, I know you've got the heart for charity, but isn't this a bit extreme?" The table went silent. Richard felt his face flush with anger, but he managed to maintain his composure. "Zoe isn't a charity case, William," Richard replied, his voice cool but firm. "She's my daughter." William chuckled awkwardly, realizing his misstep, but the tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just William. Others at the table exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Richard knew that this was only the beginning. The adoption had raised more than a few eyebrows, and he was starting to see the ugliness of the world he had once thought he understood so well. But the scrutiny from his peers was only one side of the coin. Richard hadn't anticipated the deeper, more insidious challenges that would arise as a result of Zoe's race. In public, they often attracted stares, some curious, others judgmental. At first, Richard tried to shield Zoe from it, but children are far more perceptive than adults often give them credit for. Zoe began to notice the way people looked at them when they were out in the park or at the grocery store. She didn't say much, but Richard could tell it was affecting her. One afternoon, as they were walking through a crowded shopping center, a woman approached them. She was middle-aged, well-dressed, and wore a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, she's just adorable," the woman said, gesturing towards Zoe. "Is she yours?" Richard smiled politely. "Yes, she is." The woman's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "Well, you're doing such a wonderful thing. It's so important to help these poor kids, you know." Richard felt a tight knot forming in his chest. Zoe, who had been clutching his hand, looked up at him with wide eyes. She might not have fully understood the woman's words, but she sensed the underlying tone. Before Richard could respond, the woman continued, "People like you, well, you're making the world a better place." Richard's polite smile vanished. "She's not a project," he said, his voice steady, but laced with irritation. "She's my daughter." The woman, clearly taken aback, mumbled an apology and quickly walked away. Richard knelt down to Zoe's level, meeting her eyes. "You okay?" he asked gently. Zoe nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Why do people look at us like that?" she asked softly. Richard's heart ached. How could he explain something so complex to a 7-year-old? He wasn't even sure he fully understood it himself. "Some people don't know how to mind their own business," he said, trying to keep his tone light. But the reality was far more troubling. It wasn't just that people didn't mind their own business, it was that they couldn't see past the surface. To them, Zoe was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in Richard's world. And to some, their relationship was simply unnatural. As the weeks turned into months, the scrutiny and judgment only seemed to intensify. Richard did his best to protect Zoe from it, but it wasn't always possible. One particularly difficult incident occurred at Zoe's new school. Richard had enrolled her in a prestigious private academy, believing it would offer her the best education possible. But the school, known for its predominantly white student body, wasn't as welcoming as he had hoped. Zoe had always been quiet, but at this new school, she became even more withdrawn. Richard noticed it almost immediately. Her usual chatter during car rides home had disappeared, replaced by silence and a downcast gaze. He tried to ask her about it, but she brushed him off, insisting everything was fine. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the truth came out. One evening, as Richard was helping Zoe with her homework, she suddenly burst into tears. Richard, startled, rushed to her side. "Zoe, what's wrong?" he asked, his heart racing. Through her sobs, Zoe finally revealed what had been happening at school. Some of the other children had been making fun of her, calling her names and making hurtful comments about her being different. They teased her for being black in a school where most of the other students were white. They made fun of her for being adopted, for not having a real family. Richard was furious. How could this have happened? How could the school, with all its prestige and resources, allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked? He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Had he made a mistake by sending Zoe there? Had he underestimated the challenges she would face in a world that wasn't as accepting as he had hoped? But as Richard sat with Zoe, holding her close and wiping away her tears, he realized something important. This wasn't just about protecting her from the outside world, it was about preparing her to face it. He couldn't shield her from every cruel comment or judgmental stare, but he could teach her how to be strong in the face of adversity. He could show her that love and family weren't defined by what others thought. Yet, even as Richard vowed to support Zoe and help her through these difficult times, there was an unease building within him. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and he couldn't control the prejudices of others. But there was something else, something lurking beneath the surface, that made him feel as though they hadn't yet faced the real test. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the feeling of impending danger was growing stronger each day. And then there was the matter, the strange phone calls. It had started shortly after Zoe came to live with him. At first, Richard didn't think much of it, occasional calls from unknown numbers, hang-ups when he answered, or eerie silences on the other end of the line. But over time, the calls became more frequent and more disturbing. Late at night, his phone would ring, and when he picked up, there would be a voice on the other end, a low, raspy voice that sent chills down his spine. "She doesn't belong with you," the voice would whisper. "You'll regret this." At first, Richard tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just a prank or some disgruntled individual trying to stir up trouble. But as the calls continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. Whoever was behind these calls knew too much. They mentioned details about his life, about Zoe, that no one outside his closest circle could possibly know. Richard gripped his phone tightly, the eerie voice still echoing in his mind. "You'll regret this," the caller had whispered, their tone laced with malice. It was no longer just an inconvenience or a minor annoyance. It was something far more threatening, a danger he could no longer ignore. The calls had become more frequent, and whoever was on the other end of the line knew far too much about him, about Zoe, and about their lives. This wasn't just a prank. It was deliberate. He set the phone down on the marble kitchen counter, the cold surface doing little to quell the growing unease within him. Richard glanced toward the grand staircase, leading up to the bedrooms. Zoe was fast asleep, tucked away safely in her room, blissfully unaware of the trouble brewing around them. He needed to protect her, no matter the cost. But who could be behind this? Was it one of his business rivals, someone with a personal vendetta? Or was it more sinister, connected to Zoe's past? He thought about the adoption process, how everything had gone so smoothly, almost too smoothly. Could it be that someone from her life before the adoption was trying to get to her? The thought chilled him. Richard's mind raced through possibilities, none of them comforting. He needed answers. He needed to understand who was behind this before things escalated even further. The next morning, Richard woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't let fear control him. He had to take action. His first move was to contact the adoption agency, hoping to dig deeper into Zoe's history and find any clues that might explain the sudden threats. It was a delicate matter. He didn't want to alarm Zoe or make her feel like she was at the center of something dangerous, but he also couldn't leave her in the dark, especially if she might be at risk. Richard sat at his desk, dialing the number for the adoption agency. He tapped his fingers anxiously as the phone rang, his mind replaying the unsettling phone calls over and over again. "Good morning, this is Everly Foster from Bright Futures Adoption Agency. How can I help you?" A cheerful voice on the other end answered. "Good morning, Everly," Richard began, trying to maintain a calm tone. "This is Richard Greenwell. I adopted Zoe through your agency several months ago. I was wondering if I could speak with someone regarding her file. I just need to clarify a few things." There was a brief pause before Everly responded. "Of course, Mr. Greenwell. I'll need to look up her case. Can you hold for just a moment?" Richard waited, feeling a strange sense of anticipation build. After what felt like an eternity, Everly's voice returned, but it sounded different, more guarded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Greenwell, but it looks like Zoe's file is restricted." "Restricted?" Richard asked, frowning. "What does that mean? I'm afraid I can't go into details. It's a highly sensitive case, and there are confidentiality protocols in place. I'll have to refer you to our legal department if you need further information." Richard felt his frustration rising. "Look, I don't need sensitive details. I'm just trying to make sure Zoe is safe. Someone has been threatening us, and I need to understand if this has anything to do with her past." Everly hesitated again. "I understand your concern, Mr. Greenwell, but I'm really not authorized to release anything. I can put you in touch with our legal team, and perhaps they can help you navigate this." Richard sighed, realizing he was hitting a wall. "Fine. Please do that. I'd appreciate it if they could get back to me as soon as possible." As he ended the call, Richard leaned back in his chair, frustration gnawing at him. What was in Zoe's file that could be so sensitive? Why was it restricted? And more importantly, could it be connected to the strange phone calls he had been receiving? Days passed, and while Richard waited for the agency's legal team to respond, the phone calls continued. They were sporadic, always late at night, always with the same cryptic warnings. "She doesn't belong with you. You'll regret this." The voice never revealed who they were, but the message was clear. Someone didn't want Zoe with him. Then one night, the situation escalated. Richard was working late in his study, the only light in the room coming from the dim glow of his desk lamp. His phone buzzed on the table, another unknown number. His heart rate quickened. By now, he was almost expecting these calls, but it didn't make them any less unsettling. He picked up the phone, and, as expected, there was silence on the other end. But this time, the silence was different. It was heavier, more deliberate, as if the caller was waiting for something. "Who is this?" Richard demanded, his voice tense. "What do you want?" The silence stretched on for another second before the voice finally responded, colder than ever before. "Check your front door." The call ended abruptly. Richard stood frozen for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a dark omen. Slowly, he rose from his chair and made his way toward the front of the house. His footsteps echoed in the vast, empty hallway, every creak of the floorboards, adding to the growing sense of dread. When he reached the front door, he hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. At first glance, there was nothing, just the dark night and the quiet hum of the distant city. But then, as he looked down, he saw it, an envelope. It was plain, white, with no markings or return address, but it was addressed to him by name. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and black and white, as though it had been taken from a distance. The image was of Zoe, sitting on a park bench, smiling as she fed the ducks in the pond nearby. But what made Richard's blood run cold was the realization that this photo had been taken recently, just a few days ago when they had gone to the park together. Someone had been watching them. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he flipped the photo over. Written on the back in bold black letters was a message: "You're being watched." The next morning, Richard's world felt even more precarious. He couldn't shake the image of the photograph, the sickening realization that someone had been following him and Zoe. Whoever this person was, they weren't just making idle threats. They were closer than he'd ever imagined. He considered going to the police, but what would he tell them? That he'd been receiving strange phone calls? That someone had left a photo at his door? It didn't seem like enough. Richard needed more information, and he needed it fast. He couldn't risk waiting around for something worse to happen. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Zoe's voice as she came downstairs for breakfast, her small footsteps light and cheerful. Richard plastered on a smile, not wanting to alarm her. "Morning, Daddy," she said brightly, climbing up onto one of the tall kitchen stools. "Morning, sweetheart," he replied, his voice warm despite the turmoil inside him. He poured her a glass of orange juice and set it in front of her, watching as she sipped happily, completely unaware of the dark cloud looming over them. As Zoe chatted about her day at school and the new friends she had made, Richard's mind drifted back to the envelope, the photo, and the chilling message. He knew he couldn't keep this from her forever, but how could he possibly explain that someone was stalking them? Later that afternoon, Richard made a decision. He would hire a private investigator to look into the phone calls, the photo, and anything else that might lead him to the person responsible. If the adoption agency wasn't going to help, he would find the answers himself. He reached out to an old friend, Marcus, who ran a private security firm. Marcus had worked with Richard in the past on business matters, providing discreet security for high-profile clients. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was him. By evening, Marcus had already agreed to take the case, and he assured Richard that he would have his best investigator on it by morning. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Marcus had said confidently, but there was an underlying seriousness in his tone that told Richard he was just as concerned about the situation as he was. That night, as Richard lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts refused to settle. What had started as a decision to give a young girl a better life had now turned into something far more dangerous. And the worst part was that he still had no idea who was behind it or what their true motive was. Could it be related to Zoe's biological family? Or was it someone from Richard's own life, an enemy he didn't even realize he had? The possibilities seemed endless, and each one more terrifying than the last. And then, just as he was beginning to drift into a restless sleep, the phone rang again. Richard jolted upright, his heart pounding. The caller ID was blocked. He took a deep breath before answering, already expecting the eerie silence that had become all too familiar. But this time, there was no silence. This time, the voice on the other end spoke immediately, the words sending a shiver down Richard's spine. "I know who you are," the voice hissed, barely above a whisper, "and I know what you've done." The next few days passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Marcus had sent his investigator, a woman named Rachel, to meet with Richard. She was sharp, professional, and immediately set to work. Together, they went over every detail, every phone call, every strange occurrence, and the mysterious photograph. But despite her efforts, Rachel was struggling to find any solid leads. The calls were untraceable, the number masked by layers of encryption. The photo had been printed on ordinary paper, leaving no fingerprints or clues behind. Whoever was behind this was careful, dangerously so. Then, just when it seemed like they had hit a dead end, Rachel discovered something that changed everything. While digging through Zoe's adoption records, Rachel had found a discrepancy, something that didn't add up. It was a small detail, buried in the paperwork, but it was enough to raise a red flag. Zoe's birth certificate. It listed the names of her biological parents, but according to the agency, both had passed away several years ago. However, when Rachel cross-referenced the names with public records, she found something startling. Zoe's biological mother was still alive. As Rachel presented her findings to Richard, his mind reeled. How could this be possible? The agency had been adamant that Zoe was an orphan, that both of her parents were gone. Yet here was undeniable proof that her mother was out there, alive and well. But why had the agency lied? And what did this mean for Zoe's adoption? Richard's mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above the rest. If Zoe's mother was alive, could she be the one behind the phone calls? The revelation was a game changer, but it only raised more questions. Why had Zoe's mother disappeared? Why had she allowed her daughter to be adopted? And most importantly, if she was still alive, why had she remained in the shadows until now? The answers were out there, but Richard knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The real danger had yet to reveal itself, and he would have to uncover the truth before it was too late. The revelation that Zoe's biological mother was still alive hung over Richard like a storm cloud. He sat at his desk, staring at the folder of adoption documents Rachel had compiled, his mind swirling with possibilities. How had this critical piece of information been overlooked? Or worse, hidden? Rachel's voice broke the tense silence. "We need to find her, Richard. If Zoe's mother is alive, she could be connected to the threats. She might want her daughter back." The idea sent a shiver down Richard's spine. Could the voice on the phone be hers? Could Zoe's biological mother have been the one watching them all along, leaving that ominous photo on his doorstep? It didn't add up. If she wanted her daughter back, why not confront him directly through legal means? Why the threats? Richard leaned forward, rubbing his temples. But why now? Why would she wait all this time to make her move? And why wouldn't the adoption agency have told me the truth? Rachel flipped through the papers again, her expression hardening. There's more to this than we're seeing. Someone didn't want you to know. We have to dig deeper into Zoe's past. The question gnawed at him. Who was Zoe's mother? And what kind of life had she led before Zoe entered the adoption system? More importantly, why had she been declared deceased when she clearly wasn't? Over the next few days, Rachel worked tirelessly, using her contacts and resources to uncover anything she could about Zoe's birth mother. Every detail seemed to lead to a dead end, as if someone had deliberately erased her from existence. But finally, after exhausting nearly every lead, Rachel found something: a name. Elaine Pritchard. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She had once lived in a small town just outside of Baltimore, but there were no recent records of her. Elaine had vanished from the public eye almost 6 years ago, around the time Zoe had entered the foster system. No employment records, no tax filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply disappeared. Richard sat across from Rachel in his study, the tension between them palpable. "Do we know why she disappeared?" he asked. Rachel shook her head. "Not yet. But people don't just vanish without a reason. There's something deeper here." Richard's mind was racing. If Elaine Pritchard was still alive, where was she? And why had she stayed hidden all these years? The more they uncovered, the more the mystery deepened. And then, the phone calls stopped. For days, Richard braced himself each night, expecting the familiar sinister ring of the unknown caller. But there was nothing. The silence, instead of bringing relief, only increased his anxiety. Something was coming, he could feel it. The calm didn't last long. One afternoon, while Richard was at work, he received a frantic call from the private school Zoe attended. "Mr. Greenwell, you need to come right away." The voice on the other end said, breathless with panic, "There's been an incident." His heart dropped. "Is Zoe okay?" "She's fine, but someone was here." They were asking questions about her. It made the staff very uncomfortable. Richard was out of his office and in his car within minutes, speeding toward the school. His mind raced with fear and frustration. Who had been there? Could it have been Zoe's mother? The mysterious caller? Or someone else entirely? When he arrived, the school's principal met him at the front entrance, her face pale with worry. "We've increased security since the incident, but we thought it was important you were made aware," she said, her voice low and urgent. A woman came by, asking about Zoe. She claimed to be a relative, but she didn't have any documentation to prove it. "We didn't allow her access to the school, but she was very persistent." "A relative?" Richard echoed, his mind spinning. "Did she give a name?" The principal nodded. "She said her name was Elaine." Richard's blood ran cold. It was her, Elaine Pritchard. Zoe's mother had finally come out of hiding, and now she was circling closer than ever. "Did she leave anything? A message?" he asked. "No, but she made it clear she would return." "She seemed desperate, Mr. Greenwell. I'm not sure what her intentions are, but I thought you should know." Richard left the school that day, with his stomach in knots. The situation had taken a sharp turn, and the stakes were higher than ever. Zoe's mother wasn't just watching them from a distance anymore, she was making her presence known. But the real question remained: why had Elaine waited so long to resurface? That evening, Richard sat across from Zoe at the dinner table, watching as she absent-mindedly played with her food. She was quieter than usual, her normally bright eyes clouded with thought. "Zoe," Richard began gently, "is everything okay? You've been awfully quiet since school." Zoe glanced up at him, her expression serious for a child so young. "Daddy, who was that woman at school today?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't wanted to tell her yet, hadn't wanted to burden her with the weight of what was happening, but she already knew something was wrong. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said carefully, "but you're safe, okay? I promise." Zoe didn't seem reassured. She looked at me like she knew me. Richard's heart tightened. What was going through his daughter's mind? Did she have any faint memories of her biological mother, memories she couldn't place? He reached across the table and took her hand. "No matter what happens, I'll always protect you." Zoe nodded, but the unease between them lingered. The next day, Richard made the difficult decision to confront the adoption agency directly. He had tried to be patient, waiting for them to reach out with answers, but now, time was running out. Elaine had made her move, and Richard needed to understand the full scope of what he was up against. He arrived at the agency's offices, his mind a blur of questions and frustrations. When he finally sat down with the agency's director, Susan Montgomery, the tension was palpable. "Mr. Greenwell," Susan began, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, "I understand you're concerned about Zoe's biological family." "That's an understatement," Richard replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "I've recently learned that her mother, Elaine Pritchard, is alive. You told me she was dead. Care to explain?" Susan's expression shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. I'm not sure where you received that information, but Elaine was declared legally dead after she disappeared. There was an investigation. Disappeared? What exactly happened?" Richard pressed. Susan hesitated. Elaine Pritchard had a troubled past. She was involved with some dangerous people. When she vanished, it was assumed she had been. The authorities couldn't find any trace of her, so they declared her dead, just like that. Richard asked, incredulous. "And now she's back, trying to get to Zoe." Susan's eyes widened slightly. "Elaine is alive? Are you sure? She showed up at Zoe's school yesterday." "I need to know everything about her, Susan. What exactly was Elaine involved in before she disappeared?" There was a long pause, and Susan seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "I don't know all the details, Mr. Greenwell, but from what I've been told, Elaine was connected to a criminal organization. She got in too deep, and when things went south, she ran. I don't know how she survived all this time, but if she's back now, it's dangerous." Richard's pulse quickened. A criminal organization. What had Zoe's mother been involved in? And more importantly, was Zoe now a target because of it? He leaned forward, his voice low. "I need you to tell me the truth. Is Zoe in danger?" Susan met his gaze, her expression grim. "I don't know, Mr. Greenwell. But if Elaine is back, then yes, there's a very real possibility that Zoe could be at risk." The revelations about Elaine's past sent Richard's mind into overdrive. He had expected complications, maybe even hostility, but a connection to organized crime was far worse than he could have imagined. The stakes were much higher now, and he had no idea how deep the danger ran. That night, he found himself pacing the hallway outside of Zoe's room, his heart heavy with fear. How could he keep her safe from something so shadowy, so insidious? Elaine wasn't just a mother trying to reclaim her daughter. She was entangled in something far more dangerous, something that could threaten everything Richard had built. And then, just as he was about to retreat to his room, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message. He pulled the phone from his pocket, his stomach tightening as he saw the number was unknown. Hesitantly, he opened the message. It was a single sentence. "Leave Zoe behind, or you'll regret it." The message confirmed what Richard had feared. Zoe was in danger. Real, immediate danger. Whoever was sending these threats was growing bolder, more direct. But he couldn't just give up on her, couldn't walk away from the child he had grown to love so deeply. But as the days wore on, the tension only thickened. Elaine remained in the shadows, never making direct contact, but her presence was felt everywhere. The threats grew more menacing, the silence between them stretching thin with unbearable anxiety. And then, just when Richard thought he couldn't take the uncertainty any longer, something happened that would change everything. Zoe disappeared. The day began like any other. Richard dropped Zoe off at school, reminding her to stay close to her teachers and promising to pick her up later that afternoon. But when he arrived at the end of the day, Zoe was nowhere to be found. Frantic, he rushed to the principal's office, demanding answers. But no one had seen her leave. The school was on lockdown, staff searching every corner of the building. But Zoe was gone, vanished without a trace. Richard's heart raced as he dialed Rachel, his voice tight with panic. "Zoe's missing. I think Elaine took her." On the other end of the line, Rachel's voice was calm but urgent. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Richard waited for Rachel's arrival, his mind reeling with fear. Had Elaine really taken Zoe? What was she planning? And more importantly, how could he get his daughter back? When Rachel finally arrived, she wasted no time. She had already put a team together to trace Zoe's movements, using every resource at her disposal. But the search was complicated. There were no witnesses, no camera footage of Zoe leaving the building. It was as if she had simply disappeared. "Richard," Rachel said quietly, "if Elaine has Zoe, we need to move fast. We don't know what her intentions are, and we can't afford to wait." Richard nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. But beneath the fear, a dark realization settled in. This was no longer just about protecting Zoe. It was about survival for both of them. He had no choice but to confront the shadows of Elaine's past head-on, and whatever secrets lay buried in Zoe's history, they were about to be unearthed. And the truth? It was far more dangerous than anyone had expected. The weight of Zoe's disappearance settled on Richard like a suffocating blanket, the silence of her absence screaming louder than any threat he'd received. Rachel's voice rang in his ear as they drove toward the only lead they had, a shadowy address found in the depths of Elaine's history, a place where someone had spotted her weeks ago. There were no guarantees, but it was their only hope. "Richard, you need to be ready for anything," Rachel warned as she drove, her eyes fixed on the road. If Elaine is involved with a criminal organization, this might not be as simple as a mother reclaiming her daughter. There's a bigger game at play. Richard could feel the dread mounting in his chest, the cold realization that he might be walking into a world far darker than he'd ever imagined. He clenched his fists, staring out the window at the blur of the city. He didn't care what secrets lay in Elaine's past. His only focus was getting Zoe back. The address Rachel had found led them to the outskirts of the city, to a decaying industrial park that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The buildings loomed like dark, silent sentinels, their windows broken, rust staining their surfaces like old wounds. "This can't be the place," Richard muttered as they stepped out of the car. "It looks deserted." Rachel shook her head. "Looks can be deceiving. Let's keep moving." As they ventured deeper into the crumbling maze of warehouses, Richard felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was wrong. The silence here wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, thick with an invisible tension. Rachel led the way, her phone in hand, tracking the coordinates they had been given. As they neared one of the largest buildings, a flash of movement caught Richard's eye, a shadow darting behind a pillar. "Rachel, wait," Richard whispered, grabbing her arm. "Someone's here." Rachel froze, her hand reaching instinctively for the gun tucked beneath her jacket. "Stay behind me," she whispered. They approached the building with caution, the doors slightly ajar. Richard could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the thought of Zoe somewhere in this twisted, forgotten place, nearly driving him to madness. As they slipped inside, the musty smell of damp concrete and metal filled the air, along with something else, something more ominous. The faint scent of smoke and something acrid. They crept forward, moving through the shadows of what had once been a factory floor. The echo of their footsteps seemed to amplify the tension in the air. "Richard Greenwell, I was wondering when you'd show up." Richard spun around, his heart lurching. There, standing at the edge of the room, was Elaine Pritchard. Her hair was longer now, darker than the pictures Rachel had found, but there was no mistaking the sharp, calculating eyes that locked onto him with the intensity of a predator. She didn't look like a desperate mother searching for her child. She looked like a woman in control of a very dangerous situation. "Where is Zoe?" Richard demanded, stepping forward despite Rachel's silent warning to stay back. Elaine smiled, but it was a cruel smile, devoid of warmth. "Zoe is safe, for now." "Where is she?" Rachel interjected, her tone icy. "If you've hurt her—" "I haven't touched her," Elaine interrupted. "She's more valuable to me alive." Richard's blood ran cold at her words. "Valuable? What are you talking about?" Elaine's expression darkened. "You think this is just about getting my daughter back, don't you? You think I've spent the last 6 years hiding because I wanted to reclaim her?" Richard clenched his fists. "What do you want, Elaine? What is this really about?" She took a step closer, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "It's about survival, Richard. My survival. And now, Zoe's." Richard's stomach twisted. "Survival from what? What have you gotten her involved in?" Elaine's face hardened, the weight of her past flashing across her features. "You don't understand. The people I was involved with, they don't let you just walk away. When I disappeared, I wasn't running from my responsibilities as a mother, I was running from them." Rachel's voice cut through the tension. "Who are they, Elaine? What kind of organization are we talking about?" Elaine hesitated, her eyes flickering with a brief moment of vulnerability. "They're more powerful than you can imagine. They operate in the shadows, controlling everything from political deals to corporate takeovers. I was involved with them once, but I made a mistake. I crossed the wrong people." Richard's pulse quickened. "And now, they want Zoe?" Elaine nodded slowly, her expression grim. "Zoe is the only leverage I have left. They don't care about her, but they know I do. They'll come for her, Richard. And when they do, they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." The weight of her words crashed down on Richard like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about Zoe being in danger, it was about all of them. The threat he had been receiving, wasn't just from some unhinged mother trying to reclaim her child. It was from a powerful, faceless organization that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. How do we stop them? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elaine shook her head. You don't stop them. You run. You disappear, just like I did. Rachel stepped forward, her face set with determination. We're not running. We can protect Zoe, but we need to know everything, every detail, about who these people are and what they want. Elaine's eyes flickered again, as if she were weighing her options. There's a safe house. It's not far from here. We can hide there for a while, regroup, figure out our next move. Richard's gut twisted. The thought of running, of hiding like a hunted animal, went against every instinct he had as a father. But if Elaine was telling the truth, and these people really were as dangerous as she said, then staying and fighting might not be an option. I'll take you to her, Elaine said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. But you have to trust me. Richard hesitated, his mind racing. Could he trust her? Could he trust the woman who had lied about her death, who had abandoned Zoe for so many years, only to reappear with a deadly secret? But as the seconds ticked by, the answer became clear. He had no choice. The safe house was hidden deep in the woods, miles away from the decaying industrial park where they had found Elaine. The drive was tense, the weight of everything Richard had just learned pressing down on him like an iron weight. Every mile they covered felt like a step deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. When they arrived, Elaine led them to a small, dilapidated cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for years. But as they stepped inside, Richard could see the signs of recent activity: fresh blankets on the bed, food supplies stacked neatly in the corner. Zoe's here, Elaine said quietly, nodding toward a door at the back of the cabin. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed toward the door, throwing it open to reveal a small room. And there, sitting on the edge of a makeshift bed, was Zoe. Daddy? She said softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Richard rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. Zoe clung to him, her small body shaking. She said you were coming. She said I'd be safe.